The smell of disinfectant mixed with lukewarm coffee hung heavy in the air of the waiting room, where rows of blue plastic chairs lined up perfectly under the cold fluorescent lights. It was a typical Monday morning at City General Hospital, and the routine played out impatient patients, overworked staff, and that ever-present sense of urgency that made everyone seem focused only on their own problems. In the far corner near the fogged-up window overlooking the parking lot sat an elderly woman with graying hair, her calloused hands resting on a worn leather purse. Her stooped shoulders told stories of decades spent caring for others, and her eyes, though weary, held a serenity that contrasted with the surrounding commotion. Eleanor had arrived in the early hours of the morning, accompanying her 7-year-old grandson, who had fallen during the night. The child, now asleep in her lap, breathed with difficulty due to his asthma, worsened by the fright and the rush. She clutched his well-worn health insurance card, watching as other families were called for treatment. One after another, people who had arrived after them were ushered into examination rooms, while the boy's name remained forgotten on the waiting list. At first, Eleanor politely approached the reception desk. She explained to the receptionist, a young woman with brightly colored hair and elaborate nail art, that the child was having trouble breathing and that they had been waiting for over 4 hours. The receptionist, without taking her eyes off the computer screen, mumbled something about first come, first served and medical priorities, as if reciting a memorized script. Eleanor returned to her seat, adjusted her grandson, and continued to wait, but her eyes couldn't hide her growing concern. Around her, the scene repeated with variations. A teenage mother rocked a crying baby, a middle-aged man pressed a blood-soaked towel against a cut on his hand, an elderly woman leaning on crutches sighed with each movement. Everyone there shared the same vulnerability, the same urgent need for care, but Eleanor noticed that some seemed to have their requests met more quickly than others. It wasn't explicit or declared, but a subtle dynamic revealed in glances, tones of voice, the haste or delay with which forms were filled out. When Eleanor rose for the third time to inquire about treatment, the same receptionist looked at her with a mixture of irritation and disdain. "You've already asked several times. When it's your turn, we'll call you," she said, raising her voice slightly so that others in the room could hear. Some turned away, others pretended not to notice the embarrassment of the situation. Eleanor felt her face flush, not with anger, but with a deep sadness she knew well. It was the same feeling she'd experienced decades ago, when she'd sought employment and was dismissed before even showcasing her qualifications, or when she tried to enroll her children in schools and was advised to seek institutions more suited to her profile. Back in her seat, Eleanor hugged her grandson tighter, whispering words of comfort in his ear. The boy, even asleep, seemed to sense his grandmother's tension and fidgeted restlessly. She began to softly hum a lullaby she'd learned from her own mother decades ago, when she was still a girl and believed the world was a fair place for everyone. Her voice, though trembling, carried a sweetness that some nearby patients noticed, and for a moment, the hostile atmosphere seemed to soften. It was at that moment that Dr. Michael, a veteran doctor at the hospital, passed through the waiting room on his way to his office. He wasn't on duty in that department, but had been called for a consultation and needed to cross this environment he knew so well. His steps faltered when he heard Eleanor's melodious voice, a song his own grandmother used to sing in his childhood. Something in that scene touched a deep memory, an elderly black woman singing to a child in her arms, surrounded by the indifference of a world that seemed to have forgotten the value of compassion. Michael discreetly observed the scene for a few minutes. He noticed how Eleanor adjusted the makeshift blanket over her grandson, how she checked his breathing with the natural concern of someone who had raised children and grandchildren, how her eyes scanned the room for any sign that they would finally be attended to. There was something about the woman's posture that intrigued him. Despite the evident anguish, she maintained a serene dignity, without rebelling against the system or creating a scene to attract attention. It was as if she carried within her an ancient wisdom on how to navigate daily injustices without losing her own humanity. Curious about the situation, Michael quietly approached the reception desk and inquired about the patient's waiting times. The receptionist, recognizing him as one of the hospital's senior physicians, immediately changed her tone and explained that they were short-staffed due to a scientific event in the state capital. When he specifically asked about the woman with the child in her lap, the receptionist glanced in Eleanor's direction and commented, with barely concealed disdain, that those people always exaggerated the severity of their cases and that it was probably just a common cold. It was in that sentence that something broke inside Dr. Michael. It wasn't just the insensitivity of the words, but the tone in which they were spoken, the casual way prejudice manifested itself, the way a human life was reduced to those people. He remembered his own journey. The son of a housekeeper and a construction worker, he had managed to become a doctor only thanks to the sacrifices of parents who worked day and night to pay for his studies. He remembered how many times his mother had come home exhausted, recounting stories of employers who treated her with disdain, and how that had motivated him to become a different kind of professional. Without saying a word to the receptionist, Michael walked over to where Eleanor was sitting. He knelt beside her chair, positioning himself at eye level with the sleeping child. His immediate presence caught everyone's attention in the waiting room. It wasn't common to see a doctor personally approach patients in the waiting area, and even less so to assume such a humble position. "Good morning, ma'am," he said, in a gentle voice that immediately conveyed confidence. "I'm Dr. Michael. Could you tell me what happened to your grandson?" Eleanor was surprised for a moment, but quickly regained her composure and explained in detail about the fall, the respiratory symptoms, and the long wait. As she spoke, Michael carefully observed the child's breathing, noting signs that confirmed the need for urgent attention. When Eleanor finished her account, he gently placed his hand on the boy's forehead and said, "We'll take care of him right now." The transformation that followed was almost magical. Michael stood up, walked to the reception desk, and with a calm but undeniable authority, instructed that the boy be immediately directed to the pediatric emergency room. The same receptionist, who had been disrespectful to Eleanor, was now rushing to provide care, clearly embarrassed by the situation. But Michael didn't stop there. He went back to Eleanor and said, "You're coming with me. I want to personally make sure your grandson receives the best possible care." Then he extended his arm to help her stand, a simple gesture but laden with meaning. He wasn't just a doctor fulfilling his professional duty, he was a human being recognizing the dignity of another human being. And here, as Eleanor walked down the hospital corridors with her grandson in her arms, accompanied by a doctor who had chosen to see her humanity, I can't help but think of you who are reading this story. If it touched your heart, if it awakened in you the same emotion I felt when I wrote it, I invite you to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell. Why? Because stories like this need to be told and retold. They need to circulate the world like little seeds of hope. When you subscribe, you're not just following a channel, you're joining a community of people who believe in the transformative power of empathy and human kindness. Each new story we share has the potential to inspire someone to be a little more like Dr. Michael in their daily lives. So if this narrative made you believe more in the beauty hidden in simple human actions, please subscribe. Your participation motivates us to continue finding and sharing these pearls of humanity that often go unnoticed in the world. In the examination room, Michael carefully examined the boy, who had awakened frightened but calmed down with his grandmother's loving presence. The diagnosis confirmed his suspicions: a moderate asthma attack, aggravated by stress and the delay in treatment. Nothing too serious, but it could have become serious if the wait had been prolonged. While administering the appropriate medication and instructing Eleanor on the necessary care, Michael took the opportunity to talk to her about her life. He discovered that Eleanor had been an elementary school teacher for 40 years, dedicating her career to educating children in public schools in the suburbs. She had retired 5 years ago and now cared for her grandchildren while her children worked. She was a widow, lived in a simple but always clean and organized house, and kept a vegetable garden in her backyard, where she grew herbs and vegetables that she shared with her neighbors. Her greatest joy was seeing her grandson grow up healthy and curious, always asking questions about the world around him. As the conversation unfolded, Michael realized he was in the presence of one of the wisest people he had ever known. Eleanor spoke about life with profound simplicity, quoted poems she had learned in her youth, and told stories of students she had helped graduate over the years. There was a natural musicality in her voice that transformed even the simplest accounts into small works of verbal art. When the boy was fully recovered and ready to go home, Michael made a decision that surprised even himself. He asked Eleanor to wait a moment and left the examination room. He returned a few minutes later with an envelope in his hands. "Eleanor," he said, "I'd like to extend an invitation to you. Every Wednesday, we hold a project here at the hospital called Storytellers for Hospitalized Children. Many of them stay here for weeks, away from their families, and need a little joy and affection. I heard your voice singing in the waiting room, and I thought, wouldn't you like to join our group of volunteers?" Eleanor was moved, but hesitated for a moment. "Doctor, I don't know if I'm adequately prepared for this." Michael smiled. "Eleanor, you have exactly what these children need: genuine love, and the ability to transform difficult moments into moments of hope. That's what you did in the waiting room today, singing to your grandson. That's what you did for 40 years, as a teacher. You don't need any preparation beyond what you already carry in your heart." 2 weeks later, Eleanor started her volunteer work. Every Wednesday, she arrived at the hospital carrying a bag full of storybooks, puppets she had made herself, and a voice that had become legendary among the hospitalized children. Her presence transformed the atmosphere. Corridors that previously echoed only with cries and whimpers now also resonated with laughter and songs. The nurses noticed that the young patients recovered more quickly on the days Eleanor visited the wards. There was something about her energy, her affectionate way of telling stories and singing lullabies, that accelerated the healing process. Doctors began to remark that the children were calmer, slept better, and showed more appetite after visits from Grandma Eleanor, as she came to be known. But the most profound transformation happened within the hospital staff itself. The receptionist, who had treated Eleanor with disdain on that first day, began to discreetly observe the volunteers' work. She saw how Eleanor treated each child with individual care, how she knew the names of all the young patients, how her stories managed to distract the children even during painful procedures. One day, during a coffee break, the young woman approached Eleanor and apologized for her treatment. "I didn't know who you were," she said, her eyes welling up. Eleanor, with her natural wisdom, replied, "Honey, don't apologize for not knowing who I was. Apologize for not seeing who I always was, a person who deserved respect, just like anyone else." That conversation marked the beginning of an unlikely friendship. The receptionist, whose name was Jessica, began to accompany Eleanor on her visits to the wards. She learned the importance of treating each patient with dignity, regardless of their social class, skin color, or financial condition. Gradually, the entire emergency department staff adopted a more humane approach, inspired by Eleanor's silent example. Dr. Michael, in turn, turned this episode into a landmark in his career. He began to dedicate more time to talking with patients, especially those who seemed invisible to the system. He implemented changes in the hospital's routine, creating protocols that ensured more equitable and humane care. His initiative served as a model for other hospitals in the region, and he was invited to give talks on humanization in medicine. But perhaps the most beautiful impact of this whole story was what happened to Eleanor's grandson. The boy, who had witnessed the entire transformation, grew up with a keen awareness of justice and compassion. He saw how his grandmother was respected and loved at the hospital, how her presence illuminated the corridors, how doctors and nurses stopped to greet her with genuine affection. Years later, as a teenager, he told his grandmother that he wanted to study medicine to be like Dr. Michael. "Grandma," he said, "I want to be able to see people the way the doctor saw you that day. I want to have the courage to do the right thing, even when no one is watching. Eleanor, her hair now whiter and a few more wrinkles around her eyes, smiled with pride. She realized that that painful episode in the waiting room had become a seed of kindness that would continue to germinate for generations. The hospital, which was once just a place of suffering in her memory, became a second home. Children who had been her patients decades ago returned, now adults, to introduce their own children to Grandma Eleanor. Young doctors, who had learned from Dr. Michael's example, perpetuated the tradition of treating each patient with respect and dignity, and Eleanor, who had arrived at that waiting room, feeling invisible and forgotten, discovered that her true vocation had always been to heal, not with medicine or scalpels, but with love, patience, and the ability to see the humanity in every person who crossed her path. On one of her last visits as a volunteer, at 85 years old, Eleanor sat in the same chair where she had waited for hours on that first day. She looked around the waiting room, now renovated and more welcoming, where staff trained in the philosophy she had helped inspire treated each patient with care and respect. A young mother, sitting with her baby in her arms, seemed anxious and frightened. Eleanor approached, offered a warm smile, and asked if she could help with anything. The mother, who felt lost and invisible in that hospital environment, suddenly found herself welcomed by a stranger who treated her like family. "May I tell your daughter a story?" Eleanor asked. The mother nodded, and Eleanor began to sing the same lullaby she had sung to her grandson so many years ago. Other people in the waiting room stopped to listen, and for a few minutes, that environment transformed into a refuge of peace and humanity. When Eleanor finished singing, the baby was sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms. The young woman, with tears in her eyes, thanked her. "Thank you, ma'am. You don't know how much I needed that today." Eleanor smiled and replied, "Honey, we all need each other. That's what makes us human." At that moment, observing the scene from the waiting room entrance, was Dr. Michael, now older and about to retire. He had witnessed the transformation of that place over the years, had seen how a simple act of compassion had created waves of kindness that spread far beyond the hospital walls. He approached Eleanor and said, "Eleanor, you know you changed this place forever, don't you?" Eleanor shook her head humbly. "Dr. Michael, the one who changed this place was you. That day you chose to see me as a human being." Michael smiled. "No, Eleanor. You changed this place. You taught me that being a doctor isn't just about curing illnesses, it's about healing humanity. You reminded me why I chose this profession." They embraced right there, in the same waiting room, where it all began. Around them, life continued. Patients arrived and were treated with dignity. Staff greeted each other respectfully. Children played while waiting for their appointments. The atmosphere had transformed into something completely different from the cold, indifferent place it had been years ago. When Eleanor finally retired from her volunteer work at the hospital, hundreds of people attended her farewell party. Doctors, nurses, staff, patients who had become friends, children who had grown up listening to her stories. Everyone wanted to show their gratitude for a woman who had taught them all the true meaning of caring. Dr. Michael gave a moving speech, recounting how Eleanor had transformed not only that hospital, but his entire perspective on medicine and humanity. He spoke about how small acts of kindness can create quiet revolutions, about how an ordinary person can become extraordinary simply by choosing to treat other human beings with dignity and love. Eleanor, at the center of all the tributes, maintained her characteristic humility. In her brief farewell speech, she simply said, "I didn't come here to teach anyone anything. I just came to share some of the love I've received throughout my life. If it made a difference, it's because you all chose to plant those seeds in your own hearts. The credit belongs to you for choosing to be better people." Years later, after Eleanor had passed away, the hospital unveiled a plaque in her honor in the waiting room, where it all began. The inscription simply read, Eleanor Chisholm, 1938 to 2023, teacher, grandmother, volunteer, and a living reminder that true medicine begins in the heart. But the greatest tribute to Eleanor wasn't written in bronze or marble. It was in the way doctors continued to kneel beside frightened patients, in the way staff treated each person with respect, in the stories told to hospitalized children, in the tradition of kindness that had taken root in that place and spread to other hospitals, other cities, other lives. Eleanor, grandson, fulfilling a childhood promise, graduated from medical school, and returned to work at the same hospital where his grandmother had shone as a volunteer. On his first day as a resident physician, he paused before the plaque honoring his grandmother and made a silent vow he would be the kind of doctor she would be proud to call her grandson. And so, the story that began with a silent injustice in a waiting room became a legend of transformation and hope. It proved that grand gestures, or eloquent speeches, aren't necessary to change the world. Sometimes, all it takes is a doctor who chooses to kneel beside a worried grandmother, a volunteer who transforms hospital corridors into gardens of joy, a staff member who learns to see humanity in every face they meet. The true magic of this story wasn't in its most dramatic moments, but in the small, everyday details that followed, in the genuine smile of a receptionist, in the extra patience of a nurse, in the story told by a volunteer, in the medical consultation that extends a few minutes beyond what's necessary because the patient needs to be heard. Eleanor had arrived at that waiting room as just another invisible person in an indifferent crowd. She left this world as a living legend, proof that every human being carries within them the power to transform environments, influence hearts, and plant seeds of kindness that will blossom long after we're physically gone. Her story became a powerful whisper echoing through the hospital corridors. Not every hero wears a white coat or carries a stethoscope around their neck. Some heroes wear simple dresses, carry worn-out bags, and possess the magical ability to transform waiting rooms into gardens of hope, one lullaby at a time.